So as we get started, we encourage you just to relax and hopefully enjoy. And I would like you tonight to start, not by putting this in the chat, but thinking about a child in your mind, somebody, a kid that has motivated you for being here tonight. And there may be more than one. So whether you teach preschool, elementary, middle, or high school, as a former middle school teacher, there's always two kids that come to my mind when I think about this topic. So as we go through this time tonight, we're going to do a quick little overview of CI3T and how this could fit into your comprehensive integrated three-tiered model. You don't have to have this model in place to do this particular type of support, but we'd like you to know the importance of being able to situate it in a model and how a lot of the stuff that you're already doing becomes the building block of this. And we're going to talk tonight about the importance of timing. And a lot of the strategies that you're going to be hearing about tonight, there are times during the acting out cycle when they will serve you better than others. And there's some times when things like offering choice, like offering a child a choice when they are literally exploding in your classroom, actually will further accelerate behavior challenges. So we want to really emphasize a little bit about paying attention to timing. Then we're going to talk through the 7 specific phrases and phases of the acting out cycle. And Mark is going to go through a description of what each one looks like. And he's going to go through what strategies are typically used at that time. And we're going to have time tonight for you to actually download materials from another part of our website where you can download a plan to write a de-escalation plan for a specific student if you would like. So know that that's coming, and we'll give you screenshots so that you know where to find it. So welcome. So let's get started. As you're thinking about what this is, many different schools have different integrated, thank you, smiling Dawn, have different integrated systems. The system that we are supporting in our work and have been working on this since 1996, it's a comprehensive integrated three-tiered models of prevention. And for some of you who have been around the block for a while, you know that this has been kind of an outgrowth of pulling different systems together. So back in the day, you used to see like right triangles, and it was just focused on academics for all, for some, for a few. And then we had similar things happening in the late 90s, 96, specifically about behavior, about for all, for some, and for a few. And then all of a sudden, those 2 right triangles showed up on the same slide. And it was just like a middle school dance where those 2 triangles right there, but nobody was touching. So that was in the days before MTSS came on the scene. And then when multi-tiered systems of support came on the scene, it was reading, math, and behavior. And I don't think it was ever intended to be this way, but somehow along the lines, people got this idea that we should do one of those things at a time. First, bring in reading, then bring in math. And then if you had time, do behavior. And nowhere present was this idea about kids' social and emotional well-being. CI3T is pulling all of those together into one integrated system. And so as you're thinking about CI3T tonight, I want to emphasize that many of you on this call already have these plans in place. And if you do, and you have access to it, go ahead and download a copy of your plan, open it up. And if you have no idea where it is, totally fine, but just make a note to say, I need to figure out where that is in my building, because you've already got the building blocks of what this is going to look like. Ideally, when schools go through this building process, they go through an entire academic year where this CI3T leadership team, which is made up of an administrator, general ed teachers, special ed teachers, and other people to support implementation, also includes a parent and that parent's child. So really, we want to make sure that the value and the culture of your community has all this input in putting together what this blueprint is going to look like. And specifically in this plan, it seeks to basically level the playing field to get everybody on the same page, faculty and staff, students, families, and administrators, so they know what are we trying to accomplish in terms of academics, like what's the mission of our work, not just academically, but behaviorally and in terms of well-being. And to that end, it's actually making transparent what a teacher knows on what has to happen in this building. And if you are a paraprofessional walking into a building, this too is for you, because it's laying out, here's what's going to happen at tier 1. And when we talk about strategies, like you are the people that spend the most time often with kids with the most intractable behavior challenges and learning problems, you need this playbook as well. At the heart of this is positive behavior intervention and support. So if you've heard about PBIS before, this isn't something different. This is just a broadening of that whole multi-tiered systems of support. And in addition to having expectations, like you raise your hand if you've seen those in your building, like be respectful, be responsible, give best effort. Thanks for playing the school game. So when you have those expectations, that's not just a song or a poster. It's literally like, it's an instructional tool. I'm going to remind kids, this is how you do it. This is how you do it. So you're going to teach them, what does it mean to be respectful, be responsible, give best effort in every setting in your building. So that it has to have clarity. And in addition to teaching it, we have to be equally positive. And we're going to talk about that tonight when the wheels fall off the bus. So we still want to have a respectful way for responding to challenging behaviors. In addition, in a CI3T model, your school or your district went through a process to pick a validated resource. We relied heavily on What Works Clearinghouse. So you look through all those things, you made a choice. And in the perfect world, those curricula, those resources are used to level the playing field for every single kid, to teach them things about how to be self-aware, how to set a goal, how to self-regulate when things aren't going very well, how to fail, how to get a new plan together. Essentially, it's like all the things that kids, we want them down the road to, to do well, to help them be successful, not just academically, but enjoy life with their friends and their family and with their adults. And someday be really great people to work with. So in this, when we talk about today about CI3T, that is what we're talking about at Tier 1. That's every single kid, when they suit up, they show up from preschool to high school, you are leveling the playing field for them, and you're providing this integrated approach to Tier 1. So in your school's plan, it probably looks something like this, where you clarified for people what they need to know for academics, for behavior, and for social skills. And when we talk about doing Tier 1, we're talking about all this. It's not a ticket, it's actually how I'm teaching social skills so that every kid's learning those same sets of skills. We're weaving them into daily instruction, and paraprofessionals, school psychologists, counselors, teachers, we need to all know what these kids are getting at Tier 1 so that when we see it happening, we can acknowledge a kid or notice that they're doing it, and we can give them the feedback that you're meeting expectations. Also in your plan, if you check out that academic side, you're going to see these strategies. And I'd like you to cue into these right now, because we're going to come up on these today. You're going to see strategies like doing behavior-specific praise, like doing active supervision, like doing pre-correction. And you've got people on this call like Eric Common and David Royer and Grant Allen and Paloma Perez-Clark, who have led, systematic reviews to synthesize this whole body of work for you. And importantly, they've taught the practice of like, how do I do that? And you'll notice that's in the academic column, because we want to actually do those things to help maximize kids' engagement and minimize disruption. So that's in your blueprint. Another thing you're going to notice that's in your blueprint is this whole idea about how you respond respectfully, showing empathy, keeping instruction moving forward. When a kid loses control, and we'll talk about this in detail tonight, we absolutely do not want to draw a ton of attention to them in a way if they're really maintained by attention, because then being out of control is going to be more likely to happen in the future, because that is what they're seeking. Some kids want to access that attention. Some kids want to avoid it. What we're trying to do when there is a problem is we want to know what it is, respond respectfully, but give them instruction on what you need to do, give them time and space to get back on track, and then recognize them, because we need to get kids comfortable with being successful. As we're thinking about all these pieces in your plan, you also have these details as to how you're going to accomplish it. Like, how do you do that whole thing? And remember, in CI3T, you are changing the child's experience by first changing the adult experience. So in your district, you probably have coordinated district plans. And many of you are here tonight, not in a CI3T school, because you're here tonight to learn, how do I do this? Like, how do I prevent and respond to really significant challenging behavior? And the first thing I want to say is, we do things at Tier 1 to prevent kids from bubbling up to the top. So this is 100%. I see people nodding their head. Nikki, Kayleen, I appreciate that, because we have to do the good work at Tier 1, and we're teaching every kid what they need to know how to do Tier 1 well, with a plan that there's still, no matter how solid you are at Tier 1, there will 100% be kids that are going to need more than Tier 1 has to offer. But if we haven't built a base where teachers know like how to do pre-correction, how to give behavior-specific praise, how to embed choices, then those strategies, as you might imagine, are harder for people to do if they haven't had the fluency of doing those on their regular day-to-day interactions with kids. So as we think about asking teachers to do these new strategies, just like we acknowledge kids, we need to make sure we got a plan for recognizing the adults in your building, for leaning into exactly what you're doing tonight. Like, people are giving up their time to be here to learn about these strategies. And this speaks volumes to the fact that this is a priority. When we think about reinforcements, if you feel like, gosh, I just don't know if this like behavior specific praise thing is working in my building, if you feel like it's not meaningful, like if you've got kids that are throwing tickets on the floor, that's a good shot that the reinforcement structure isn't meeting their needs yet. So that means we need to talk to kids to find out what are things you like to get and what are things that you like to avoid. This is an example of a preferred parking spot at a high school. And I remember when we first saw these, some people thought they were built for our project staff or when we went there, but these are actually kids. So kids could enter to win a CI3T parking pass for the week. And these were closer to the building than the principal's spot. Another high school did this really cool thing where they could draw kids' names to sit in the end zone, and they got to bring a friend with them. And so they got to enjoy this game, and they had pizza delivered at that. And that was like, that cost very, very little. And for kids that are attention motivated and love sports, that was a thing. One of the middle schools that we worked with that same year, like, oh, we want to do that. We want to have middle schoolers win spot to come sit there. And the high school people are like, I don't want your middle school kids in my end zone. So you're going to have to make sure things are socially valid for all. But keeping all this in mind, before we even get to working with the kids that kind of rise to the top of the triangle, so to speak, we want to make sure that you're taking a moment to like look at your own school-wide data. These are student risk screening scale for internalizing and externalizing data. And thank goodness so many of you have these data already, and you can do tonight's strategies without them. But if you have them, like, I can look and see that at this particular school, they're internalizing behaviors. Like, there's more kids with internalizing issues right now than there were pre-pandemic. That makes a ton of sense to me because of all the insecurities. We have all lost people that we've loved during this, or we've been restricted access to people that we love. And this is another thing that doesn't surprise me. Actually, in some schools, even though it may feel like behavior is way out of control, compared to pre-pandemic levels, check this out. In this building, there's about 78% of the kids that are now in the low risk for acting out behavior, compared to previously about 65%. I honestly think that part of this is because when the pandemic happened, we tightened up really, really fast on what expectations were like when we had to mask up, wash our hands, or use hand sanitizer and social distancing. We became great at teaching expectations, and many of you built those right into your teaching expectation matrices. And that's all good stuff. And so since that time and prior to it, a lot of people have been doing a great job about using multiple sources of information, because although we're talking about behavior, acting out behavior today, hardcore behavior, it does not occur in a vacuum. And we need to know about how a kid is doing academically to get the total picture. If I am somebody that is showing up as having tier 3 needs for acting out behavior, you also need to know that maybe I have tier 3 needs for math and tier 2 needs for reading. And importantly, you definitely need to check out my data on attendance, because if I'm a kid who's missing a ton of school, it shouldn't be surprising that I don't know how to play the school game. I'm not there enough to get good at it. So we want to look across, and I'm watching Susan Zeddy nod. It makes sense, right? We want to make sure we're looking at multiple sources of data so that we can start to think about what kids need. And one thing tonight, I'm hoping you will do, whether you're writing stuff down or just thinking about it or typing about it, one of the biggest gifts I think you can give to yourself and to your colleagues in your building is time to learn those low intensity supports, because these you're going to hear about tonight. And if we can get really good at knowing how to do these throughout instruction and do these in the hallway and do these in non-instructional areas, we have the gift of helping to increase kids being positively engaged where they are and reducing disruption. So keeping those strategies in mind, and there's places on our website, we have other resources that we can connect you with, and a lot of these have pre-built PowerPoints, etc. I also want to say that an immediate consideration you might start to think about is, in your own context, think about building on-site coaches in your building. So Rana or Leslie or Maria, they might in their building think about, like, tonight, one of their main takeaways might be, you know what, we need to start building the capacity of the adults in our building to feel comfortable to know what behavior specific praise is and how to do it. And in my building, I want to make sure that I know that there's a bank of people that I can go to that can be the on-site experts for like how to do instructional choices and build them in. So it doesn't have to rest on all in one person. And there's so much talent in your building. And through the years, we've learned from people that sometimes people feels like the principal likes 5 people because they get to do all the professional learning extra stuff. So we want to make sure that we are capitalizing on the talent of our building and building people's capacity. Up to this point, if you are lucky enough to work in a school or in a district that has a tiered system, in the perfect world, the base will have clarity on here's what we want to provide for kids in terms of an academic experience. We empower teachers with low intensity strategies to help them access it. We've clarified behavioral expectations by surveying the entire faculty and staff in your building to say, what do you think kids need to know to be successful? That's the stuff that is in that expectation matrix. So we teach it. We give kids an opportunity to practice it. They get recognized for it. And we know they're still going to screw up sometimes. So we have to also make sure that teachers are empowered with a way to respond without increasing angst in that situation. And every kid, when they come into school, they're going to get the same instruction on core skills that are going to help them to become self-determined, lifelong learners. That's the tier 1 experience. So if you're lucky enough to have that, awesome. And if you're not, that is okay, but we need to know what is your base, because what we're talking about tonight is going to build on the base. So before we get into the steps, we want to notice that for acting out behavior, most of us are here tonight because some people want the checklist of tell me the 5 things I need to do when the kid is losing their mind in the classroom, throwing the chair, hitting somebody, blah, blah, blah. I want to say that we owe it to ourselves and that child and the entire other group of kids around and everybody's families. We need to work hard, hard, hard to prevent that kid from getting up to the peak behavior. And the good news is we know so much of what to do now. We've learned through the years together, researchers, practitioners, parents, families, we've learned that there's some very predictable times when kids struggle. And we think about like, sometimes it's for kids when it's a change in routine, even when it's a great thing. Like if there's an assembly or something fun happened, the change in the routine is tough. For some kids, it's just day-to-day transitions, like being able to, get from the cafeteria to lunch or get from lunch to come back in. Part of what we want to do is we want to identify those really predictable times when challenges occur. And then we need to take a look around and we need to engage in some function-based thinking, like what's the why? Like one time I got asked to come out to a school and they're like, Kathleen, like all hell is breaking loose, like in the cafeterias. It is just tons and tons of fights. And I walked into the cafeteria and I looked around the cafeteria and they're like, it's mayhem. And the way the building was set up, there was a door here that was open and there was a door here it closed. And I did ask the question, I'm like, tell me about how kids come in and get out for lunch. Well, kids came in through that door, got their food, they had to sit down, they had to raise their hand, wait for their space to be cleared, and then they could leave through that same door. Well, the problem was kids were bottlenecking, coming in and coming out, and there was only that one door open. And I did ask the question, like, why is that other door not open? They're like, oh, we had to cut support for supervision, so we closed the door. So, and I know how this feels because sometimes we're so close to it, we can't see it. Our big intervention was open the other door because basically they needed a way to come in and a way to get out that wasn't causing kids to friction, but they couldn't see it. And I've been in the same situation. We've moved around a million times. I've been on faculty at University of Arizona, Cal State, Los Angeles. I was in Tennessee at Vanderbilt for 10 years. I was at UNC Chapel Hill, and now I've been at University of Kansas for 10 years. And when we moved out of one of our houses in Tennessee, it took us 18 months to sell our house. And every day I'd put my kids in the car, lock and load them in a car seat, and I'm running around like putting panties away and dusting off doors and stuff. And so finally, we hired a stager. And what do stagers normally tell you to do? They say, get stuff out of your house. This lady, no joke, hands me a multi-page document, single space with pictures. She's like, this place looks like nobody lives here. This is a cold, impersonal house. I'm like, ouch, ouch. And then I look around, I'm like, she's right. I never wanted to move into that house in the first place. I never decorated. It looked terrible. So we brought stuff in, staged it, put some other people's kids up there in the pictures, and that didn't sell. And I say that because be respectful when we go in and make these observations, because these are people's classrooms, these are people's buildings, and we spend more time there than we do at our home. So as we're thinking about this situation tonight, and we're going to hear from Mark in these different stages, please remember that by the time people are asking for help to manage kids with really challenging behaviors, they have done everything that they know how to do. And please don't open up your mouth and say, let's start by collecting some more data, because they will want to hurt you. When people are at this point, they want help right now. And the good news is we have the ability now to build integrated systems, because there is so much more complexity to teaching. We're asked to do so much more academically, behaviorally, and socially, and we want to do so in an inclusive environment. So tonight we are going to introduce this acting out cycle. And I'd like you to notice that across the bottom is time, across the top is intensity. And as you look at these different stages, calm, trigger, agitation, acceleration, peak, de-escalation, and recovery, I'm going to ask you, when we get to that point with Mark, to think about what does it look like and what can I do about it? And before we get to those conversations, I would like you to know something wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And I mean this not an ounce of sarcasm. The best thing I can tell you right now is that when managing acting out, the adult's first response is the best predictor as to whether or not that kid is going to ramp up or calm down. And that's great. Now, the problem is sometimes, like when we're in those situations, it feels scary when things like you see a kid starting to escalate, you can see them starting to brew. And so sometimes we lock up and then the kid locks up, and then it does become this escalating thing. But after tonight, you're going to have some basic understanding of what it looks like in those stages, and you're going to start to build some fluency about how to step in. I'm not saying we're responsible for everything that's happening necessarily. I am saying, though, the good news is we don't have to just sit and watch it happen. How we respond is going to set the stage for how it goes. So keeping that in mind, there's some concepts you're going to hear about, like about behavior chains. And I think about it like a necklace. And I used to have a pearl necklace and I would wear it on this night, but I lost it in one of our moves. Nonetheless, when you think about a necklace, it's like a behavioral chain that like each behavior becomes more serious than the one in the next part, right? So they're all connected and they start to escalate. But the good news is if I can interrupt that acting out cycle as early as possible, I can make the whole necklace break apart. Like I can stop that acting out from happening in the first place. And so when you start to think about what does this look like for you, like with that kid that you have in your mind right now, think about like, you might say, I'd like you to do this. The kid says, I already did it. I don't think you did it well. I think you need to go back and check your work. No, I already did it. And you start to argue. Does that, everybody's like smiling and nodding right now because it feels familiar. Our goal here is to interrupt this before they get really, really amped up and start to accelerate. And I remember moments when I was in particular a middle school teacher, and I love teaching middle school. I was a middle school teacher by choice. Like I went into teaching by accident, but man, I loved my middle school kids. And I remember one day in my building, and I taught a self-contained class, and there were kids that had some pretty significant behavior challenges in there. 24 kids, district average was 15, so don't worry about it. So there was a lot of kids in that class. And I remember one day, and I could just feel it, like the kids were like escalating and it was getting kind of nuts in there. And I was young at the time, a little bit more mobile than I am now. And so I stood up on top of their desk in front of the room. And I'm like, stop in the name of love. And then I went on from there. And every single kid just like, they stopped their argument, their chicken chesting thing. And they just looked at me like, has the woman lost her ever loving mind? And I did it intentionally. I used humor. I did not make fun of one child in that class. I did not do any sarcasm, but I needed to do something to interrupt the acting out cycle. And I'm not suggesting you have to stand on top of a furniture and sing, but if you've got it in you, make it happen. But I am suggesting that we need to think about what can we do to help it from getting more serious. So as we set the stage for knowing tonight, we're going to be working through these stages in the acting out process. We're going to start right now by spending the next 10 minutes. What are you currently already doing in your base? Like what do you've got in your base? So share about what's in your district or in your classroom. So go ahead and talk about your successes, what you've got, what you're hoping to get, and we'll see you back here in 10.
So thanks everybody for the chance to talk tonight. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. Just to give you just a little bit of context for who I am, my name is Mark Buckman. I'm a former special education teacher and actually worked as a paraprofessional for 5 years before starting as a special ed teacher. So I worked with a lot of students with behavior disorders, a lot of kids that had pretty major acting out behaviors. And I always felt like I could say that I had seen everything. And then every year, you go back and you see something new. So I'm sure a lot of you have experiences with students that do engage in challenging behavior and acting out behavior and escalated behavior. And we're going to give you some practical strategies for how to think about those behaviors and also how we can respond as that sort of acting out cycle occurs. So what we're going to do during this time is we're going to walk through each phase of the acting out cycle, and we're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like so that you can kind of identify when students are in any certain phase. And we're also going to talk about what you can do to support students at that time. Kathleen said something earlier that I think is so important, and it's just a phrase that you can kind of think to yourself that timing is everything. Because there are so many great things that we can do as teachers, but not every option is a good option for the current circumstance. So you always want to make sure that you kind of have a sense for where we are in the acting out cycle so that our responses are going to be well matched to where students are. So we're going to walk through calm, trigger, agitation, acceleration, peak, de-escalation, and recovery in a sequence so that you can kind of see what the ramping up cycle looks like. But we'll kind of be focusing on each stage, hopefully actually interrupting the cycle. So the goal here is to actually avoid ever getting to that peak phase if we can. And the way that we're going to do that is that our responses actually as teachers have a lot of opportunities to interrupt the cycle from taking place. Oops, let's see here. And Kathleen mentioned this before, that our initial response is actually a great predictor for what the outcome of the acting out cycle is going to look like. And that's great because it does give us some efficacy in the situation to really make sure that we have the chance to hopefully prevent those peak behaviors from occurring. But it also puts a little bit of pressure on us too, right? Because it kind of means that we have a role to play here. So as you're thinking about this tonight, I just want to emphasize that you do not have to be perfect. I know that in some of the situations that I found myself in, I sit back and reflect and say, oof, I could have done that differently. There's something I could have done that would have better prevented that from happening. And that's okay, because every time that we come across an instance of these challenging behaviors, it's just something that we have to have the ability to reflect on and always think, what can I do better next time? And I also want to say that as educators right now, I think we're all kind of under pressure that's a little bit new. I know with COVID and everything that's happening right now, it's a tough time to be an educator. And so sometimes when we come to school and we feel stressed or we feel maybe a little bit agitated ourselves, it can change our responses a little bit. So I just kind of want to say we need to give ourselves permission to not be perfect, and also permission to say, I don't control the situation in its entirety. I can only be a positive support for this student. And so we always want to keep this relationship that we have in mind with our students to just say, I'm going to be the best that I can be for my students today. And that's just the best that I can do. And that's just really important that we give ourselves permission to be a really great support system for our students, but we don't have to be perfect. So let's jump into the first phase of the acting out cycle, which is calm. So the calm phase is basically when things are going great. This is when instruction is taking place, students are academically engaged, students are being responsive to praise and feedback, students are engaging in interactions with each others, and they're showing goal-directed behaviors. Goal-directed behaviors are basically where students know what they need to do to be successful, they have a goal, and they can do what's necessary to achieve that goal. So this is great, and we want to make sure that we can maximize the time in the calm phase. So sometimes when we have students in our classrooms who we know can be sometimes a little bit volatile, their behavior can escalate, and we're a little bit wary of that. It can cause us to tiptoe around those students to some extent. And sometimes that causes us to actually avoid providing the same instruction to those students that other kids get. And that's actually an issue, right? We want to make sure that we're using this calm time to deliver instruction as planned. And particularly also like keeping in mind students who might have additional needs. This is the opportunity that we have to teach adaptive skills, coping strategies, self-regulation skills. When students are calm, they're able to learn and they're able to engage in that instruction. So we really need to make sure that we're taking as much advantage of this calm time as we can, because this is when we can make the biggest impact on teaching new skills. So to maximize this time, we want to make sure that we're just using our CI3T structures as planned. We're providing academic instruction that's engaging and varied and fast-paced. We're using behavior-specific praise to acknowledge students for meeting expectations. And we're using other low-intensity supports like pre-correction and active supervision to make sure that we're monitoring students and what they're doing and engaging in them and helping keep that positive momentum moving forward. We also want to attend to physical environments and just kind of make sure that if kids are kind of getting grouped up in a certain place, or if there's something in the physical room that actually might cause an issue that might cause an issue to happen, it's a good time for us to interrupt that possible wrinkle in the environment and try to prevent anything that might cause a trigger, which is going to be the next phase that we'll look at coming up. So the next phase in the cycle is trigger. And so when we think about what can be triggering to a student, there's two different groups or categories that we can think about. We might think about school-based triggers, which are things that are happening right now in the building or in the classroom, right in front of our eyes, that might cause a student to start to feel escalated. Their behaviors might start moving towards that crisis cycle. So this could include things like conflicts with peers, changes in routines, sometimes like teasing or bullying circumstances can make kids get defensive or upset. Pressure. This could be perceived pressure from the teacher to the student, or sometimes students putting pressure on themselves if they're trying to do a difficult academic task or being asked to do something that's just a little bit outside their comfort zone. Sometimes kids can respond really strongly to that, and that can become a trigger. Sometimes students don't really have great problem solving skills. So something that's a small issue can turn into a really big issue if students don't have the ability to work through that problem, or just asking for help sometimes is a skill that students don't have. And that can be something that can trigger thus escalating behaviors as well. A really common one in my experience, one that I think can cause a lot of issues, is students having difficulty receiving feedback. And like as teachers and educators and paraprofessionals, feedback is an important part of instruction, right? We don't expect people to be perfect and getting the right answer all the time. So we have to be able to provide correction, but sometimes students can take that in the wrong way or take it in a manner that's not intended. And that can kind of send things a little bit sideways on us. And so sometimes that can act as a trigger as well. And then the last one that's really important to kind of keep in mind is that sometimes a trigger can be the denial of something that's needed or perceived as being needed. So humans have fundamental needs, right? We can be hungry, we can feel pain, we can be thirsty. And those are needs that we need to be able to meet. And sometimes when we ask for something and it's denied to us, maybe it's not actually critical that you get it, but a student often might feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going to die if I don't eat food right now. And whether or not that's real, sometimes that can be something that can set off those escalated behaviors as well. So there's another kind of trigger that's non-school-based triggers. So things at the home that might be stressful or challenging, and particularly in our current circumstances, I think a lot of families are under quite a bit of stress, and that can definitely have an impact on students, and they might bring that to school with them. This can also include health problems, unmet nutritional needs, inadequate sleep, and even substance abuse and gangs and things that are happening in the community that are definitely impacting students. And they bring those experiences to school with them, and absolutely can contribute to challenges that happen at school. And additionally, sometimes these things stack up too, right? Like if you're having trouble at home and you're not sleeping well, maybe food is not it's not available in the home like they really need it to be. And then they come to school and they have like a little problem that suddenly turns into a big problem because of all those other things that are happening at home that are contributing to that sense of unwellness or distress. And so we need to be mindful that sometimes even a little trigger, something that seems very inconsequential to us, can have a big impact on a student because their lived experience includes all these other things that sometimes we're not super aware of. And so sometimes those can contribute to kind of an outburst that might surprise us. So what can we do with the knowledge that these triggers might exist? So one thing that we need to keep in mind is that prevention is always going to be the absolute best thing that we can do. So before triggers occur, we want to know that students maybe might be reactive to things. Maybe we're just cognizant that this student can be a little bit volatile. What we need to do is make sure that we're getting out ahead of that, identifying potential situations that might trigger a student or circumstances that might rub a student the wrong way. We need to be teaching skills to help them recognize, what's the problem? How big of a problem is it? What can you do to get around that in a way that's going to be positive? and not cause you too much difficulty. And then beyond doing that, we're going to pre-correct. So if we know a situation's coming up that's going to be hard for that student to kind of deal with in a positive way, maybe it's a schedule change, like give them a heads up a while beforehand and say, hey, remember the schedule is going to be a little bit different today, but if that feels a little bit stressful for you, let's remember that we have some breathing strategies that we can do. And then we're going to rehearse how we can use those strategies to address this challenge, right? And so keep in mind that we want to do all of this skill instruction and reminding at the calm phase, because that's when students can hear us. That's when students can learn these skills. So those are really important sort of prevention things that we can do. Another important thing to do is making sure that we have strong collaborative experiences and relationships with families. So if there are things that are happening in the home that might cause a student distress and causing difficulties, we may not be able to solve that at school, but we definitely want to make sure that we are aware and working with students to make sure that we can try to address those needs the best we can. So if you have kids that are coming to school and they're exhausted or they're hungry, like let's try to make sure that those needs can be met in whatever way we can at school, so that we're taking one of those non-school-based triggers off the board as much as we can to just reduce the pressure on those students and set them up for success. So those collaborations with families are going to be really helpful for just being aware of what those triggers might be and doing some things that we can that are within our control to prevent the impacts of those triggers. And then just always, our low intensity supports, opportunities to respond, behavior specific praise. These are great things that we can do that are going to be providing engaging instruction and creating strong relationships with students so that we can try to work around those triggers as much as we can. So when a trigger occurs, the next step in the cycle is agitation. So when a trigger impacts a student, we might be able to perceive that in a few ways. For some kids, you're going to see an increase in behavior. This could be just kind of like becoming a bit of a busybody. Sometimes kids will get up out of their seat and pace when they're starting to get agitated. It might be off-task behavior, kind of getting out of their seat or knocking their pencil off their desk or kind of playing with things in their desk. So we kind of call that like busy hands. They might become verbally off-task and sort of babble or become kind of excited in their tone of voice. They might have darting eyes. These increases in behavior are suggestive of an increasing alertness and maybe a little bit of an escalating emotional state that we need to be aware of because it's causing that agitation to occur. Sometimes though, kids will have a different reaction that's kind of the opposite of that, but it's the same. It's telling us the same thing. So sometimes this will be decreases in behavior. Some students will become withdrawn. They'll be hard to reach. They might be staring into space. They might be staring down at their laps. They might refuse to respond to questions or conversation that's being directed in their way, and kind of be just kind of withdrawn and kind of in another space. It's really good for us to be able to pick up and be aware of what kinds of response a student might be showing when they're agitated, because this is the stage that we really have got to make sure that we kind of identify, because this is one of the last times that we have a really good opportunity to interrupt the cycle before things start to escalate further. So at this time, what we want to do is we want to focus on reducing student anxiety. And we can do that by, number one, showing empathy, just acknowledging that there might be a problem, there might be something that's happening that's bothering that student, and just kind of getting on their level. We want to be, not invading their space, give them their personal space, but we want to connect with them and say, hey, it looks like something might be bothering you. Is there something I can do to help? And by coming at it from that angle, instead of being maybe like continually redirecting and saying, remember, the expectation is to do this. I need you with me. Come on, the expectation is to do this. We start accidentally badgering a student, even though we're trying to support them, we're really kind of piling it on. And at this stage, when someone's getting agitated, their openness to your feedback is getting less and less, right? They're kind of getting more within themselves. They're getting worked up. So we don't want to be piling it on. We want to show empathy and make sure that we're communicating and that we're here to support you. This is the perfect time to provide reasonable options and choices. So if there's a trigger that's right in front of that student that's a problem, this might be the time to say, hey, you know what, maybe you need a few minutes before you get started. Why don't you go run down and grab a drink from the water fountain and then come back and I'll check in with you in a few minutes. That's a good choice because oftentimes people just need a quick break to reset, get up, move a little bit, come back. So when we're saying choices, we're not saying maybe take the demand completely away, but just giving an option to blow off a little bit of steam and then come back when we're a little bit more regulated. And when we're giving choices, we also want to make sure that we're not pressuring the student to make a decision right now. We want to speak slowly, speak clearly, and then give time for the student to respond. Because when students are agitated, they need a little bit of extra time to process. They're feeling a lot, they're thinking a lot, and by giving them a little bit of extra time and space to make a good choice, that's one way that we can support them. And during this time, it seems a little bit counterintuitive, but give the student some space. You actually can physically walk away from a student after you've checked in, given a good choice, given a helpful little reminder. You can walk away and maybe engage with another student who's doing the right thing and being successful, or give help to another student who needs some help. And by doing that, we're basically communicating to the student that, hey, I'm here to support you, but I also have other things that are happening that I need to support. So the pressure isn't all on the student to respond right now. We're sort of saying, okay, I'm going to give you what you need, but then give you some time to make that good choice. Another thing to keep in mind here is that Kathleen mentioned this concept of behavioral momentum earlier, and as agitation is occurring, more and more momentum is piling up towards escalation. So it's going to be harder and harder to divert that behavior momentum into a more positive direction. But if there's something really easy that you can do, maybe it's something as simple as like a quick little distraction. Maybe it's a quick humorous comment. Kathleen might jump up on her desk and shout a little song. Oftentimes, a little bit of humor in the situation can be a great way to just shake it up a little bit and put that momentum, put the brakes on that momentum and shift then to a more positive response. But you do want to be careful that you don't accidentally suggest that you're taking their agitation lightly. You certainly don't want to suggest that you might be like teasing them or making fun of that agitated state. And obviously you wouldn't mean to do that, but sometimes kids or even any adults in an agitated state might actually misinterpret your efforts to be supportive or humorous as maybe being off-putting to them. So I just want to be careful with how we try to do this little behavioral momentum shift. But if we can find something that will just kind of interrupt that cycle, this is really the time to do that. So agitation is really important. The early phases are really important because this is our best chance that we have to divert into a more successful outcome.
So the next step in the acting out cycle is acceleration. So if we have gone through that agitation phase and we've tried to change the trajectory a little bit, but haven't been successful, that's okay. Again, sometimes that's going to happen. What's that going to look like in the next phase? So we're going to see those same agitated behaviors, but ratcheted up a little bit. So this can look like questioning and arguing, noncompliance and defiance, provocation of others. Sometimes this is one that I heard all the time is you'll hear a student say like, stop looking at me. And they'll kind of feel like their peers are kind of persecuting them because the peers are obviously recognizing that there's a challenge going on. Sometimes it'll be kind of a little bit of whining or other avoidance-based behaviors. And then for some students, this is going to start to look pretty aggressive. There may be some threats or verbal abuse that might be directed at the teacher or at their peers. And so as things are kind of escalating towards a peak, we need to have in mind, okay, so what are our goals at this time? And we need to start really refocusing our attention at this time on safety. We want to make sure that if there's something that we can do to head off a crisis at this time, this is the time to do it. And when we're supporting students, a lot of times we want to avoid accidentally reinforcing behaviors that aren't really very helpful for the student in terms of like, we don't want to accidentally communicate that if you complain, I'll take away your assignment. But at some point, when a crisis is brewing, it may be actually best for us to kind of remove task demands for the moment. We're not going to say, okay, fine, you don't have to do it. We're just going to say, you know what, let's step back. Let's take a little bit of a breather. I'm going to take this away from you if it's the work that's triggering it. If it's a peer in the area, you might tell that peer to move into another area of the classroom to give the student some space. So anything that we can do to remove anything that might be triggering that acting out cycle from continuing, you want to make sure that you can do that at this time. It's also really important for us to think about our demeanor at this stage. We want to try to stay as calm and respectful and detached as possible. It doesn't mean that we're cold, but it means that we're not going to be feeding into the excitement and agitation that the student is showing. And we can do this by being non-threatening, non-confrontational. We're going to maintain a personal space, and we're going to be talking in a conversational voice that's direct and clear, but we're not going to be shouting or talking louder than we usually would. In fact, we might actually be getting a little bit quieter. We also want to take a body stance where our hands are in front of us and kind of maybe even like folded. So, kind of just like this, just so that we're really making ourselves small and non-threatening to the student as much as possible. And then in terms of what we're going to talk about with a student, we want to do something called non-confrontational limit setting. So what this is basically it's the opposite of ultimatums. So ultimatums is if you don't follow directions, I'm going to call your mom. Or if you don't complete your assignment, you're not going to be able to go to recess. We're saying if you don't do this, then you can't do this. What limit setting is all about is having a clear conversation to say, hey, like remember, that if you're shouting, your friends might actually be a little bit scared of you right now, and that you don't want that. So let's try to be calm. And what can we do right now to help you to feel a little bit calm and to take your voice level down a little bit? So we're talking about consequences, but we're not talking about them in a way where it's saying, I'm going to do this to you as a punishment, but rather helping them see the consequences of their action that are just natural consequences of the behaviors that they're engaging in. And we also want to keep in mind that with limit setting, it's as much about listening as it is about us talking, if not more about listening. So we're having this clear little conversation with them, but not in a way where we're lecturing. We're kind of narrating the circumstances in a way so that they can see what's going on and kind of see what their choices are, but making sure that we're not trying to control their behavior. We're explaining what the circumstances are at this time. So we've talked about the acceleration phase, and hopefully we've been able to head things off at this time. But if we haven't, here's what we might expect to see at the peak stage. So this is where we're going to see potentially some destruction of property, some degree of aggressive behavior potentially. Sometimes students will engage in self-injurious behavior, like kind of hitting themselves or scratching their skin, a severe tantrum with crying and screaming. Some students will hyperventilate with really rapid breathing. And in some cases, students will engage in eloping behavior or running away from the classroom environment. And oftentimes you'll see these behaviors occurring together. And this can be scary, right? This can be scary for us as adults. It can be scary for the peers who are seeing these behaviors. And honestly, it's scary for the student who's having this difficulty and engaging in these behaviors. Nobody likes to feel out of control. So what do we need to do at this stage to manage this as best we can? At this time, our focus is exclusively on safety. So we want to remain calm. We want to solicit support from our colleagues. So we're going to use whatever crisis management plan you have in your building, which likely is going to have some procedures for calling for people, maybe from the office, maybe your counselor, maybe you have a de-escalation team or a group of individuals who can support this work. But you're going to want more people to come and help manage the situation if possible. And so if there is anything that's going on that is like putting people in absolute imminent danger, then of course you want to follow your school and state procedures for any emergency safety interventions that might be put into place. And then also making sure that we're following those procedures to the letter and spirit of the law in terms of reporting and doing any additional notifications or documentations that needs to take place from that. And really the critical thing here is that we need to learn from this stage. You'll notice that there's really nothing on this slide other than focus on safety and do anything we can to keep people safe, because that's really all there is to do in terms of the response. But what we want to make sure at this time is that we're doing everything we can from this moment on to hopefully avoid the situation from happening in the future. So really learning from it is the most important thing. And oftentimes this is going to be a collaborative effort in the future, relying on a team of people to do a functional behavior assessment. And if you have questions about what that means, your coach can talk about that in your breakout room. Creating a behavior intervention plan, potentially doing mental health assessments, and seeking supports in the community and with the family to hopefully make sure that we're addressing whatever the students' needs are that might have contributed to this situation occurring. But yeah, at this stage, really, we just need to do anything that we can to keep everybody involved safe. And I'll also kind of call back on one quick thing that I mentioned earlier, which is that sometimes we bring stress to school, and sometimes we bring stress to situations. And if you're finding yourself in a situation that's kind of at this peak stage, and you feel a little bit stressed or traumatized from the circumstance, just know that that's kind of normal, and that you shouldn't beat yourself up or feel bad about that. And you should definitely be asking for help as well from others to help talk through what happened, and we'll talk about recovery later. And when we do that, sometimes there's opportunities for us to have conversations with our colleagues too, and kind of work through what happened, and make sure that we're trying to address this in the most positive way possible. So once we've managed the situation, oftentimes the peak will occur, and then we'll start to see this de-escalation process. So what this might look like is a student, those peak behaviors will subside to some extent. They might look tired or exhausted or confused. Sometimes students will try really hard at this time to reconcile and apologize. Other times you're going to find that students will withdraw into themselves. They're not going to be acting out in this really overt way, but they kind of might be pulling into themselves, or they might be denying what happened or placing blame on others. But at the very least, they're sort of engaging in these verbal interactions instead of being physical and engaging in those peak behaviors. So we're at least seeing some ramping down of the behaviors at this time. So what do we want to do at this time? The first thing that we want to do is we want to focus on being vigilant that we're not going to be re-escalating behavior, or that the student isn't going to spin themselves back up into that peak phase. So we want to make sure that we're monitoring just to make sure that people are staying healthy and safe at this time. Oftentimes we're not going to be doing a whole lot of conversation at this time. We're just going to be present, be physically there, be supportive. We're not going to be trying to engage in any sort of blaming or judgmental discussions, or really even trying to push them too much to talk about what happened. We're just giving time and space for us to kind of physically relax and come down from this escalated time. Because the reality is that when students get to that escalated behavior phase, they've got adrenaline flowing through their bodies. They're very, very physically ramped up. And when you get to that peak phase, it takes a little bit of time for that to subside and really get down back to baseline. So we want to make sure that we're facilitating that return to a recovery stage instead of doing anything that might push us back into that escalation phase. And sometimes the best thing to do at these problems, just as something to do to get your mind off of something and kind of get back to that normal state, great. Maybe it's a coloring page, just something that they can do that's calm and calming for them to kind of get back down to their baseline phase. And speaking of that, the next step in the acting out cycle is recovery. So overall behaviors are going to show eagerness to get back to normal, and possibly the reluctance to really interact or discuss what was going on. So at this time, you might see kind of a subdued or really exhausted state of kind of being for that student. You might see them being a little bit defensive or a little bit of avoidant of having conversations because maybe they're feeling embarrassed or just reluctant to really acknowledge what happened. But we're at least kind of back to that phase of like, we can have a conversation, right? We're sort of back here together with each other. So what do we want to do at the recovery phase? We want to focus on getting back to normal activities to whatever extent is possible. At this time, instructional time has been lost, opportunities for teaching and learning have been lost. So we want to get back to hopefully the opportunity to kind of get back to that calm phase and getting back to instruction. That said, if there are any consequences that need to be followed through on, this is the time to do so. But you don't want to get so hung up on any sort of like major consequence that it's going to interrupt trying to get back into some sort of normal flow of instruction, right? We want to get back to teaching and learning. We want to positively reinforce any displays of appropriate behavior. And when the time is right, we want to debrief and go through a problem-solving routine. So we don't want to just let this situation fall by the wayside and not acknowledge it. We need to do a debrief, but we need to make sure that we wait for this recovery stage to do so, because this is the time where we can actually really learn from what happened and be productive in terms of coming up with some solutions. So what does that debriefing need to look like? So we want to use this as a way to get back to normalcy. It's not something to get really hung up on and kind of beat somebody up about what happened and kind of like hammer home like what went wrong. Instead, we want to get back and problem solve and see what we can do to get back to that normal state. The goal is to increase appropriate behavior. And so working through to both like in the moment right now, getting back to appropriate behavior, and then in the long term and kind of the grand scope of things, teaching more appropriate behavior and more adaptive skills. So by doing a focus on problem solving, like identifying what went wrong, what happened, what did you feel like, what could we do differently, that's going to be hopefully important for helping the student to kind of work through in their minds how that felt for them, and help can pinpoint some things that they can do differently. We don't want to make this a punitive experience. So I know sometimes this can fall into sort of this it's like a forced apology almost, where it's like, oh, I have to say what I did wrong. It's sort of like going through the motions. This really needs to be an authentic experience where we can have an honest conversation with the student, to kind of work through this circumstance that happened. And ideally, this is something that's going to build relationships and not kind of tear them down. So we really want to avoid any sort of blaming or anything like that. And we're just really trying to come to a positive resolution, that hopefully we can kind of use in the future to avoid that circumstance from happening again. So at this time, we've gone through the whole acting out cycle, talk through some of the content that we just covered, and kind of ask questions or talk with each other about the phases and the strategies for responding at each stage. So Jamie. A lot of people do really kind of hope for sort of a playbook for, okay, when challenging behavior is occurring, what do I need to do? What are my steps? And so we kind of want to give just one way to think about this here in this section that's about pathways. Like, this is sort of a pathway that we can use, that's a pretty reasonable and effective way that we can respond to just normal off-task behavior. So this isn't necessarily about like explosive behavior. This is just sort of, what do we need to do when something's not going quite right in the classroom? How can we respond? So a lot of folks actually will have in their reactive plan. I know our breakout room was just talking about how their school has a reactive plan that sort of has a 6-step process built into it that provides this standard pathway that we can follow. It's like a playbook for responding to challenging behavior. And this is similar to that. Basically, it works like this. So the first thing you're going to do is, when there's a challenging behavior that's occurring, we're going to ask ourselves a question. And it's a really important question. Actually, there's 2 questions. We first want to ask, is what's happening right now suggesting like a can't do problem or a won't do problem? Because it helps us to understand like what's going on with like behavior is communicating something. And what is this child telling me? Are they telling me that this is too hard for me? I literally cannot do this. Even if you gave me, a whole bag of M&Ms to get me to do this, I couldn't do it because it's outside of my skill set. That's a can't do problem, right? It's just not something I know how to do yet. If you ask me to solve calculus differential equations, it doesn't matter what you can give me $1 million. It's not going to get me to solve that problem. Can't do. There's also won't do problems. These are things that that they're within my skill set, but I'm choosing not to do. It's not really what I want to do right now. The reason that we want to ask that question is our response oftentimes is going to be dictated by, do I need to tweak what I'm asking the student to do to just put it right back within their skill region? If so, that's actually a pretty easy fix. Just make it a little bit easier. Maybe provide a little bit of scaffolding to make this skill a little bit easier. Maybe ask a little bit less that's more reasonable with respect to their ability level. If it's a won't do problem though, we actually need to change the contingencies a little bit. Oftentimes, what we need to do with won't do problems is make it more appealing to do the thing that they currently don't want to do. Having your school's universal reinforcement system or token economy is a great way for doing this, because oftentimes with won't do problems, just providing a little bit more reinforcement or giving better things that students can exchange those reinforcers for, we call them backup reinforcers, or letting them exchange their tickets more often. Like just making little tweaks, sometimes that can actually help make something that I don't want to do that, but actually if you shape my behavior and make it really appealing to do that, maybe I can actually get myself to kind of be in a position to be more agreeable in following directions. The other question we want to ask ourselves is this a major behavior? Is this a crisis, or is this a minor behavior? Because if it's immediately a major behavior, we know that we're in the realm of the acting out cycle. We're thinking, is this agitation? Is this acceleration? Is this a peak behavior? How we're going to respond accordingly. If this is just a minor behavior though, like little things in the classroom, off task, acting out stuff, here's what we're going to do next. We're going to show empathy. but we're also going to maintain the flow of instruction, right? We don't want to let our class be derailed by little acting out behavior, because oftentimes that's giving too much reinforcement to the wrong behaviors, right? We want to reinforce the expected behaviors, not the challenging behaviors. So we're going to keep instruction moving forward. We're going to communicate that our attention is best gotten by following directions, by meeting expectations. So we're going to verbally recognize students for being on task. We're going to, with our body language, we're going to be directed towards the students who are meeting expectations. And after having done that, we're going to move to the fourth step, which is redirect and reteach those expectations. We're not talking about a lecture. We're talking about really briefly. Remember, the expectation is to be responsible by coming over to the reading group. And then we're going to move right along and continue moving instruction forward. We're not going to give too much attention to those acting out behaviors. And then as soon as we have the opportunity where that student is showing any signs of compliance or getting back on task, we're going to acknowledge that behavior immediately by just saying that the best way to get my attention is by being on task and engaged. And even if it's not fully engaged, if it's like just an approximation, it's a step in the right direction, grab it and go with it. Maybe don't be over the top, because sometimes if you go over the top and you're like, ooh, that was more than I wanted, but just a little quick acknowledgement, that's oftentimes the nudge that you need to kind of put things back on the right track. And the book that we're showing you right here, sorry, my Zoom screen is in the way. Diffusing Disruptive Behavior is by this guy named Geoff Colvin, who's actually the author that has done a lot of the work that led to the presentation that you saw tonight. So we can kind of we'll make connections to his work in the thank you email. So if you're interested in kind of going deep on this content, these books that he's written are wonderful, wonderful guides and resources for getting really good at diffusing disruptive behavior.
And he also wrote a book that came out the same year on bartending, which I think is an important note.
I think it's about using PBIS strategies to
in a bar setting. Yep. Love him.
Appropriate bar related behavior. You know, why not? Why not?
Right.
ABA
Programming for generalization. These kids will be there eventually, right?
Well, I don't know if I want to go that far. So our 4 key strategies, just kind of the big picture. We want to take an instructional approach to behavior, which means we're always teaching behaviors and supporting behaviors. We're never just going to be punitive. We're never just going to say what not to do. If someone's struggling, we need to be emphatic about what they can do to be successful, not what they shouldn't do to avoid failing, right? Because that's how we teach people the skills that they need to, by being clear about what you can do to be successful. Number 2, we want to intervene as early as we can in the acting out cycle, because our best bet is always going to be the earlier we go, the easier it's going to be to shift that behavioral momentum into a positive way. The 3rd key strategy is to learn strategies to intervene at each stage and to identify when each stage is occurring so that we can appropriately match our response to where that student is in the cycle. And the 4th thing is, this is be respectful at all times. That's good, but I would go a little further and say, be mindful of your relationships at all times, because none of this works if you don't have a good relationship with a student. If you accidentally train the student to see you as someone that's going to be aversive or on them or lecturing or nagging, suddenly it becomes a little bit harder to help them be positive, to help them engage. If they see you as someone that they know that you are there to support them, that they know that they can trust you, to even if that student makes a mistake, that they always have you to rely on, that they know that they can count on your relationship, all of this becomes very feasible to do because you at least have that relationship as the foundation on which to help them. And no matter where they're at today, no matter where they're at in the acting out cycle, they know that they can count on you and trust you. And that's such a gift as educators, to be that person for somebody that really, really needs you. Even when it's hard, and I know, oh my gosh, it can be really, really hard to be constructive and emphasize that relationship at all times, but that is the best thing that we can do. Be respectful and be mindful of our relationships. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna shift to is to turn what we talked about, the phases, the de-escalation phases, into an actual intervention. So we call this building a de-escalation plan. And of course, CI3T is a tiered system. Tier 1 is for all, Tier 2 is for some, Tier 3 is for few. You probably have relatively few students who are engaging in peak behaviors often enough to really need a de-escalation plan. But if you do have students, and maybe you have more than you wish, but if you've got these kids in your building, it's probably a good idea to start building plans like this so that you have a game plan for responding. So what you're going to see here are 2 images of resources that you can find on our website. if I'm sure my colleagues will put this in the chat, our professional learning tab of the website has a tiered intervention library. The very, very last folder in that library says de-escalation plans. If you open that up, you'll actually be able to download these documents. And what they are just structured ways for you to think in a structured way about a student's behavior across the acting out cycle based on your experiences with that student, and then to document what the expected responses are for the classroom teacher, the paraprofessional, the gym teacher, the librarian, the principal, the dean of students, whoever's going to be interacting with that student at any time during the potential acting out cycle. We're going to be just making it really clear what we are expecting ourselves to do at each phase. And the benefit of doing this is it's going to make all the guesswork come out. It's going to ask less of us to improvise in the moment, and it's going to give us a really careful, thoughtful plan for what we think is the best way to help prevent that escalation from continuing and to keep everybody safe if we do hit that peak cycle. So basically, it's a structured brainstorm across the phases for how do we know when the student is at each phase, and what are we going to do at each phase to help prevent and respond based on their behaviors. So if that sounds like something that would be a good idea for you to kind of think about how to incorporate this structure within your school, the place to put this, and this can be a conversation that you might have with your school CI3T leadership team, or if you're a member of your team, you might bring this back to your team and look in your tier 3 grids. And what you can do is you can add a row for individualized de-escalation plan. And actually on the website, the place that my colleagues will help you get to, where you can download these materials, we actually have a row that you can actually just copy and paste into your tier 3 grids. And this way, when you've got teachers who at the beginning of the year, maybe it's in August or September or October, and the first time this happens with their student, they're like, oh my gosh, I have a kid in my class who has some really escalated behavior sometimes. You want to steer them to their tier 3 grids, and hopefully they're going to see individualized de-escalation plan, and the teacher's going to be like, yeah, we need to make a plan for this kiddo. This is a good place to start. So having that in your tier 3 grid kind of gives you a good option for when teachers are going shopping for interventions, just to kind of prompt them to go and find this support and start this conversation. So what we're going to do is actually talk about this idea of creating a de-escalation plan, access this on the website.
And I truly want to thank you all so much for being here tonight and thinking about acting out behavior. And I think as you're taking a step back before you leave tonight, thinking about the idea that if you're in a CI3T building, you've got what to do at tier 1, that section about like in your behavior column, it'll show up like those reminders to every single person about show empathy, keep instruction moving forward. And now I hope you've had a chance to take just a quick look at those resources that Mark mentioned on our website, where you can actually build this out as a tier 3 support within this framework, or if you're in a district or a school that's not yet doing an integrated tiered system. We also wanted to take a moment to connect you as we close out with some other resources. So in this PowerPoint slide, remember, you can download this off our professional learning tab, and then you can have access to these links. We also put some illustration of some of Geoff Colvin's books. We left out the bartending book, but we really think he has done some phenomenal work. Mark said, no, it's there. He's done some phenomenal work through the years. He's at University of Oregon. He is now a professor emeritus. But the important work is continuing on. He's now collaborates with Terry Scott, who is at University of Louisville, which is where our own David Royer is also on faculty there. So do check out some of those resources. And if you would like other information on managing the acting out cycle and looking at disruptive behaviors, there's also 2 free access modules through the IRIS Center, which is funded by at Vanderbilt University. So check out some of those resources. And we want to emphasize this is one of other tier 3 supports that you might have in place. I think this is really important foundational knowledge. And I think it also gives you an opportunity to let people know that the base that you're building that uses all those low intensity strategies, this is going to be like taking all the tools and putting them into a toolbox and coming up with a coordinated plan. And I did want to mention, as kids get older, upper elementary, middle, and high school, as you're building that de-escalation plan, talk with them and walk through that with them in a con moment, not when they're struggling, but with their families, with input from educators in the building. it really communicates to them that we're really all here thinking about what's the best possible way we can help you to really jump in, engage, limit disruption, and really have a much more enjoyable experience with your friends and with teachers. And you will be amazed at how clear kids are in telling you what the challenges are. And some of those triggers that Mark talked about are removed in time and place. They're not things that we see every day. Not every kid's going to roll into our building calm. Sometimes they come in not having slept well, things happening the night before. So as we're thinking about validated tier 3 supports, meet them where they are. I think you're incredible human beings. And we do hope that tonight was a useful step into putting these tools together in an organized way. And when we come back for our next Project Empower session, we're going to talk about kids that also have internalizing behaviors. And specifically, we're going to talk about some of those low intensity supports that you can use with them. And so strategies like pre-correction that we really focused on a lot tonight, that can also be useful for kids with internalizing issues. And although we have these planned as 2 separate sessions, these are not mutually exclusive. One thing to keep in mind is that often it's the acting out behavior that's quick to capture our attention because it's really disrupting our environment in our classroom. A lot of kids, and as Constance is nodding, a lot of kids come in with both, but what we see is the acting out stuff. So we do hope you'll come back and listen with us and learn with us and share some of your many wonderful things. You guys are tearing it up in the chat tonight, so I appreciate your full engagement in that. And as you're checking out next resources, we do, as I mentioned, have that last one coming up. It is April 19th. We still have spots available. And I also wanted to mention one other thing that everybody's welcome to if you would like to come. We host monthly CI3T trainer and coaches calls. And these are places where you can drop in, you can ask about building these models, about implementing them, and it's kind of like an open mic time. You are all wonderful and welcome there anytime. Our very own Grant Allen, who's at University of Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin at Stout, is in charge of these. So if you sign up on that link, he'll go ahead and help you to get connected to those dates, but feel free to come and you can meet other implementers there. So again, a special shout out to everybody that's here tonight. And as Mark mentioned, something that I think is really important for us to close with tonight, you don't have to be perfect at this. And we're going to have moments where sometimes we say things that we wish we would have done a little differently. Give yourself the same grace and the same empathy that you would give to your students.